Hello and welcome to the debate at Ptv World. This is going to be something that we're going to take a look at in today's show in reference to what is happening in the international community and, of course, the ways in which we have seen multiple steps being taken with regards to the current situation of the international community, with particular focus, of course, on the genocide in Gaza and Israel's expansionist designs in the Middle East. Following, of course, the attack on Doha, we have seen that there was an Arab Islamic summit that was held in which Pakistan also was participating and co-sponsoring, and this issue of course was discussed and put at the table. A number of options exist in terms of the Muslim countries or the Arab states getting together with a united stance against Israeli aggression. However, whether or not there have been tangible outcomes of the summit and what is it that it's going to lead to remains to be seen. We understand that there is a defense pact that has been agreed upon by the GCC, but this is of course very integral in terms of the actual action that such a defense pact could take, and what sort of shape and form will this defense act be put in terms of a real response to Israeli aggression, because what is being discussed in terms of what happened in Doha is something that can extend beyond that, and of course indeed has done in the past. And at the same time, the genocide in Gaza continues. That requires an immediate ceasefire for any action to be taken against Israel to make sense and for its growth and expansion to be stopped. This is something that we'll focus on in the debate today, wondering what is going to be the outcome forward and the steps that will be taken in response to such attacks, and of course the existing scenario, and what do the big players like the US have to say about the situation, and then of course what Pakistan can do more in terms of making sure that this happens. For this discussion, as always, in the studios, I've been joined by senior analyst Farooq Batafi and Raja Faisal, and we've also been joined online by political analyst Dr. Scott Lucas. Thank you very much, Scott, for joining us and being a part of the discussion. And I'd like your take first in terms of whether or not you see the possibility of the Gulf or Arab states actually getting together for a unified stance against Israel.
Well, I think the question here is, what can the Gulf Arab states do? Certainly you express statements that condemn both the Israeli attack on Qatar a few days ago, trying to kill Hamas's negotiators while negotiations are supposedly ongoing. And then, of course, what is the expansion of the Israeli military operations with what is going to be the leveling of Gaza City in the next few days? I mean, the Arab states can't take on Israel militarily. You can't go to war with Israel, so that's not going to happen. Politically, you're still locked into this idea that Qatar is mediating when there's nothing to mediate, to be honest with you. So, politically, you're at a dead end. And economically, what can they do economically to try to limit Israel? I mean, the fundamental here is that the Netanyahu government has made the decision, despite the fact that much of the world is against it, and despite the fact that much of the Israeli population is against it, and despite the fact the Israeli military is against it, they've made the decision not only to try to assassinate the Hamas negotiators, but to try to overrun the rest of the Gaza Strip, to establish what is going to be, for the foreseeable future, an Israeli occupation of Gaza, a West Bank on steroids almost. And that they will say openly, such as Benjamin Netanyahu has said, and the defense minister, Israel Katz, has said, they are going to destroy Gaza unless Hamas surrenders. I think what is probably more interesting for a wider discussion, but doesn't deal with the immediate horror that's taking place. What is interesting is how the Gulf states are going to reconfigure their political and economic relations more broadly, when they not only are looking at what is happening regarding Israel, but when they're looking at a Trump administration that they thought was on their side. They thought they had flattered Trump, they had won Trump over, but they see Trump, not only accepting the Israeli attack on Qatar, but he knew about the attack in advance. That's come out in the last 24 hours through the excellent journalist Barak Ravid. So, do they look to China now? Do they look to Russia? Do they look to Europe? Who do they look to in terms of their political, economic, and military links?
Right, absolutely. But also, Scott, in terms of the ways forward that we want to see this, we've seen perhaps some sort of direction being taken in terms of the defense pact, and whether or not that's going to actually mean some real defense point or some sort of action that can be taken? Do you think that there will be a response that the different countries in the Arab world can get together on in terms of a defense posture against what is happening?
Well, I mean, I guess the first issue in a way is whether Gulf states, can agree to work with each other. And, and you can't just treat them as a single bloc. We're only a few years removed from Saudi Arabia enforcing a 2-year blockade on Qatar because of divisions between those countries. These countries do have, to a degree, different perspectives on certain political issues. Certainly, they had different perspectives on Hamas. I mean, Qatar hosted Hamas for many years. Other Gulf countries much more skeptical of Hamas. But I think even beyond that, again, a unified stance. I think diplomatically they can put out the statements in terms of condemnation, but when it comes to the military position, for example, you've got countries that are locked into long-term contracts with U.S. companies. You've got countries which only recently, when Donald Trump was there a few months ago, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that was taking place. Do you actually break those contracts and walk away? Um, I think if I was to look at a starting point on this, I think we're going to have an interesting moment at the UN General Assembly at the end of this month. So, in fact, only in a couple of weeks' time, you're going to see a series of countries finally recognizing the state of Palestine. Okay, good. I mean, you should recognize the state of Palestine. Most of the world does. How do you build upon the fact that you have recognized the state of Palestine to establish a position when, if you can ever get out of the horror of what's happening in Gaza, you can make this happen? Are the Gulf states going to be able to agree amongst themselves, but then work with other countries? And by that, I mean European countries. By that, I mean countries like Pakistan, right? To actually talk about a unified political approach. I just have to give you a wait and see on that answer.
Yeah, Professor Scott, when we talk about the latest statement coming from the Netanyahu and his, of course, cabinet, it is that they will be attacking Qatar once more, and wherever they want, of course, they will be going behind Hamas. At the same time, the counter statement was coming from Washington, and in which it was assured to Qatar that there will not be any attacks from Israel extended to Qatar anymore. Can we say that this statement match was being played by both US and Israel just because of one reason, that they just wanted to reassure the Middle Eastern countries that US is the country that can play a role and US is pivotal for Middle Eastern peace?
I think the fundamental here is that the Trump administration had to do something regarding its position in the Gulf because, I mean, publicly they said, of course, they were notified of the Israelis before the attack. The public position is that Israel decided to act independently, but at the very least, and I don't buy it, by the way, now, I think the Trump folks knew the attack was coming, but at the very least, they look weak. So they have to, I think, and this is why Marco Rubio, part of why he was in Israel before he go to Qatar, was to talk to Netanyahu and I think say, look, we really we can't agree to you going in for a second attempt. You failed to kill these Hamas negotiators, these senior officials. You can't go after them again. At the same time, I think the other half of this is equally important, which is that Rubio effectively gave full support for Israel's assault on Gaza City and establishing the occupation in Gaza. Because I'll, your viewers will know this, but let's just be very clear here. There are no negotiations for a ceasefire now. None. Zero. There haven't been for months, to be realistic, because Netanyahu has not been willing to negotiate over a ceasefire, but now it's confirmed. So, the Trump administration now has to give up the facade that it's trying to broker a ceasefire and come off the fence on Gaza. And I think they've come off on the fence behind Israel, even while telling the Israelis, okay, you can expand in Gaza, but don't go with another attack on Qatar.
Right, and Farooq, I want your perspective on that, because while we've seen that sort of rhetoric coming out from the United States, there is still, of course, a question mark in terms of whether there's an actual rupture or possibility of any sort of friction or step back in terms of how the nexus is or exists between the US and Israel. Given, of course, we can take Trump on face value and understand that he may not be very happy about this step being taken, but that doesn't amount to much if there isn't any real consequence coming in from the US.
All right. Thank you very much, Sana, and my greetings to Professor Lucas. Regarding what you were saying, Sana, first of all, there is evident sign of friction.
Okay.
For example, you talk about the Axios story. Professor Lucas actually referred to that by Ravid, which actually claims that Netanyahu spoke to President Trump regarding this attack beforehand. But on the other side, we also saw something very interesting that was going on. And that is that the White House has repeatedly said that they were informed afterwards, after the attack. So there is a public point of friction. If you remember, when Iran was being attacked by Israel, at that time also President Trump had announced a ceasefire, and after that too Israel kept on bombing Iran. At that time also it was considered that maybe Israel won't listen. Friction is there. It is quite well documented, and mind you, this is what is happening in front of cameras. Otherwise, when you look at the situation behind the cameras, we keep on hearing news. I'm sure you have your friends, I have my friends in that orbit, and we keep on hearing that there is huge friction, and it continued from Trump 1 administration, then in Biden administration, and now as well.
But what will be the extent of it in terms of action? Will the US change its policy?
That you have actually hit the matter on its head, because in America the Israeli lobby is very strong, right? Professor Mersheimer actually wrote a book on this, and just read that and you start getting lightheaded, because there's so much information that how much and how meticulously they invest in various lobbies inside America. So that will not make any US president's job easy to go whole hog actually after Israel, or to try to actually stop it. Remember, Biden administration tried to actually impose an arms sale embargo on Israel, and that didn't actually end up very nicely. So I don't think there is that kind of an impact, but in the end, what I understand is President Trump has this madman doctrine where he can get in front of camera and can say anything. That actually helps his case, because he can go on air and he can say that you have to stop or something to that extent. Otherwise, then what is possible is that he can personally encourage some kind of creation of coalition among GCC countries on the security level. Remember that while we keep on talking about Abraham Accords, but even then there's only one country, UAE, which is in any kind of alliance with Israel. Other countries are not. So convincing them and to actually encouraging them to develop their own response to any kind of violation of sovereignty of any country is not that difficult. That can happen. One more thing that is needed to be highlighted here, and that is regarding the state of affairs within Israel. I think that within Israel also there is a lot of pushback for Netanyahu, but we still have to wait and see how that actually plays out. Remember, at this moment, while you can say that these countries are not united or they might not be, they realize if today it is Qatar, tomorrow it can be any other country.
Absolutely.
So far, Israel has been using the Hamas card very well, because it always claimed that it was after Hamas.
Yeah.
But that won't last very long.
Yeah, this is of course something very integral, Faisal, in terms of how we are viewing the situation, and in terms of course, what impact there is on Israel. And while that is something that can evolve in that direction, there is also the other direction in terms of the pressure that exists, or the pressure that can be put on Israel from the Arab or Muslim states. And we've been talking about what sort of a stance they can keep against Israel, but in terms of actually the understanding or analyzing the prevailing situation, I want your take on how do you think the Gulf states or the Arab states have reacted to what has happened in Doha, and particularly when we look at this summit, of course it was timely and had a great participation, but in terms of taking it seriously or having a stance or opinion on the matter, do you think that everybody's on the same page?
Yes, and obviously when we talk about GCC countries and by the looks of it, of course, what I was seeing is that GCC countries, they are taking the lead in terms of ensuring their own peace, and of course they have allies like US, and of course still they want to exploit the alliance with the US and some of the Western countries. They believe in them because they have of course contributed in their economies heavily, and of course they want to continue with that, but they have to reaffirm their stance in the Middle East. So far, of course, it is being displayed that Israel is more dear to the Western countries, especially US, rather than the GCC countries. Overall, GCC countries, they don't want any of the rest of the Muslim countries to be nominated as they are participating in this defense of the Gulf countries, but at the same time, there are countries like Pakistan who are willing to stand for GCC countries and who are willing to stand for brotherly Muslim countries. To me, I think the propositions of all of the 57 Muslim states standing together against Israel in terms of putting pressure on the United Nations as well as ICJ regarding those who were convicted of crimes against humanity, of genocide, they should be treated as criminals, and people like Bibi Netanyahu and his cabinet, his defense minister, all of them who were of course convicted and still they are roaming around very freely. I think that is more viable, because in this context, countries like Ireland, countries like Spain, many of the Western countries, including the Scandinavian countries, they will be standing with the Muslim countries, they will be standing with the Middle Eastern countries when it comes to this, bringing it on the table of United Nations Security Council. And I think that would be the positive way forward regarding that. I think that's how it should be. To me, I think that is more important, how to drag Israel to United Nations Security Council.
Right. Professor Scott, I want your take on that too, in terms of when we're looking at the way that this is going to be approached, and of course in the ways that we would like this action to unfold. Where exactly do you think that you see the possibility of that happening? The UNSC, something that Faisal is pointing to, but do you think that that's the right avenue where some potential change can actually occur?
And Professor Lucas, because you're going to talk about this, let me add to this question regarding one important thing, and that is, so far from what we have heard from you, one would actually imagine that you are not very hopeful. So when it comes to study of history, what do you think is the end state here? How things are going to unfold, and whether Israel would get away with whatever it wants, or do you think that there is a possible correction in the future?
Easier, because again, at the risk of sounding negative, nothing's going to happen through the UN Security Council because the U.S. is there, and the U.S. is going to cover Israel. Even if Donald Trump's irritated with that the Israelis would go in and attack Qatar, and even if it causes him a bit of niggle, because the thing is that not just Qatar but Saudi Arabia, UAE are going to express their agitation. The U.S. is not going to let the Security Council pass any type of resolution to put pressure on Israel. any action which takes place, and it may largely be symbolic, but it has a political importance, actually will come through the UN General Assembly, where you have had the votes, including this week, which have condemned the Israelis. And I think you made a really, really good point. It's going to come through bodies like the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. I personally hope that the International Criminal Court's prosecution continues now to the point where there is a trial of Benjamin Netanyahu, even if it's in absentia. And I certainly hope the International Court of Justice proceeding does get to the point where we have a ruling on whether or not this constitutes a genocide. By the way, you folks will have noted today that the UN independent panel of experts, that 3-member commission of inquiry, has actually said that this is a genocide which is taking place in Gaza. But those are longer term steps. The fact of the matter is that we are dealing with an imminent threat to 2.2 million people in Gaza. More than 65,000 conservatively have already been killed. Death toll is probably far higher than that. But every single person in Gaza is at risk of being starved to death or at risk of being blown apart, including those 800,000 in Gaza City. And regrettably, there's very little that can be done at this point. I think what is going to happen, if I was to map it out, is that as long as the U.S. is protecting Israel, I think Israel does establish this occupation of Gaza. I don't think it's a stable occupation of Gaza. And just as, to be honest with you, the occupation of the West Bank is not stable as well. But the problem is in defining that endpoint, is that even if I think the occupation of the West Bank has not been stable, it's now, and I'm doing my math really quickly, 58 years that Israel has occupied that territory. And of course, they occupied Gaza until 2005, have walked out, they go back in. I think probably the interesting point is going to come from within Israel itself. Benjamin Netanyahu remember, he's fighting for his political survival, but he's also fighting for his legal survival, because even as this attack on Gaza City takes place today, his trial is ongoing in Israel. I think if Israel does not return the hostages, does not get the hostages back in particular, I think it's going to build up pressure on Netanyahu. And if he falls from power, then I think that space opens up, because I'm not sure the next Israeli prime minister will be as wedded to Netanyahu, to this, quote, destruction of Hamas. I'll add one other thing, however, and this is where the international community is going to be important. I do think there has to be a very clear line that you cannot put Hamas back in power in Gaza. That's gone. There's no way. So which Palestinians are you going to deal with? Which Palestinian groups are you going to work with? Which civil society groups? Which economic groups? Which technocrats? Because the challenge here is, and I have to be honest with your viewers, is that the Palestinian Authority, you can't just simply say they go in and take over Gaza, because they've got some issues around how they have governed the West Bank that we can discuss on another program.
Right. Professor Scott, there's also the concern then, as you've pointed out yourself, in terms of how long it took for an international body to actually call a genocide, when the entire world was doing that already for so long. This is something that is troublesome, not just in terms of claiming it as what it is, but also in terms of how it, of course, delays justice or the end of suffering of anyone, and then, of course, in particular, in this situation, the people of Gaza. Building on that, do you think that all the action points that you think are a possibility in terms of what can happen to Mr. Netanyahu, isn't that a concern in terms of this being too late, to where the occupation is already complete, where the damage that had to be done, and of course indeed the lives that had to be lost, are already lost, and there isn't really much that then remains to be saved?
It was too late. It was too late in November 2023. I mean, the fact here is that after Israel responded to Hamas's mass killing by choosing the military route of mass killing rather than the political and economic route of isolating Hamas, it was too late. And in a sense, you can't necessarily solve this immediate crisis quickly, but you have to say, how can we deal and make sure the next one doesn't come up? There will be, I think, a point when the Israelis will have to stop in Gaza. They'll just have to simply stop killing. They'll have to simply stop starving people. Well, what does the international community do then? The problem here is going to be, and I will be honest with you again, is that nobody gets convicted of genocide unless they've been defeated militarily. I'm going to tell you that and have to be honest with it. When you talk about the reason why Nazi Germany is held to account for genocide, which it rightly should be, it's because they lost World War II. Um, Israel, unless it's militarily defeated over Gaza, is never going to face an ultimate reckoning over genocide. But the international community has got to go ahead and set down markers and say quite clearly, yeah, this was a genocide. This was what took place here. And you have to then say that while acknowledging Israel's right to exist, you have to say there will be a state of Palestine. Bottom line, there will have to be a state of Palestine, and you have to start working towards that. Because until you get two states that are recognized, that their systems are accepted, and that their security is accepted, we're going to go round and round on this. I mean, this just simply is the worst, by far the worst episode of violence that we've had. If you don't resolve this, there'll be another spout of violence, whether it's Gaza, West Bank, or beyond in the Middle East within a few years.
Right. Dr. Lucas, let me take you back to a concern that you aired earlier. And you were saying that there is going to be a consensus that Hamas does not come back to power. The question right now is that the last elections that took place in Gaza were in 2009. And since then, there hasn't been any election at all. So what gives you or anybody this idea that Hamas is popular at all? Of course, they were usurping people and they will be rejected if there are elections. But Israel actually keeps on blocking those elections as well.
Yeah, I actually think that Hamas ruled as an authoritarian party within Gaza. Ironically, what helped keep them in power was the Israelis. I mean, you'll know the story that from 2021 on, Benjamin Netanyahu worked with Qatar and through Qatar effectively worked with Hamas to bolster them in power because he didn't want the Palestinian Authority. That was who he was targeting at that point. So this was, a game of politics rather than democratic choice where Hamas got. I think the point that I'm making here is even before you talk about getting back to a process of choosing a government in Gaza, if we can ever get back to this point, you almost, in a sense, have to draw a line against Hamas being able to stand in that because Hamas crossed the line in October 2023. They crossed it with that mass killing, that act of war. And it was an act of war against Israel. We have to acknowledge it was, even if what the Israelis did was an even greater act of mass killing. So there's not an easy answer in terms of how you restore a system, a functioning system in Gaza. That's why I'm saying that there has to be some creative thinking amongst people, whether it's in Pakistan, whether it's in the Gulf states, whether it's elsewhere, of which Palestinians can you open negotiations with? Which Palestinians can you actually start discussions with in terms of how we can get to a system of governments? And there are some who are there. Unfortunately, some of them also happen to be in Israeli prisons because the Israelis fear that they actually would be a responsible Palestinian leadership.
Professor Scott, earlier you have mentioned that as we know that there are cases against Bibi Netanyahu, and somehow if we can expect a change that can be from within Israel. Of course, we are talking about the political system of Israel. If they can bring another prime minister who happens to be lenient towards the actions which are being taken against Gaza or against Palestine and rest of the countries at the same time. But knowing the facts about Israel and the political history of Israel, there is a deep state called Zionism, and that Zionism actually killed one of their own, very own prime ministers. I'm talking about Prime Minister Rabin back in 1995 only because of one reason, and that was Oslo Accord. While he was celebrating that, he was killed by the Zionists themselves. Will there be any other future leader who thinks of peace and, knowing the facts about the political history of Israel, head towards peace? Will there not be, all of them following the footsteps of Netanyahu because it was all safe for him?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, but I'm someone who believes history isn't linear. History boomerangs. And by that, let's take about the fact that who would have thought if you were in the early 1970s that Menachem Begin would have made a peace deal with Anwar Sadat, the Israel-Egypt deal, the Camp David Accords. And of course, what happened here is that history boomeranged because of the 1973 war. where Israel was found to be vulnerable, that it couldn't just impose its will. So you wound up having that settlement a few years later. I mean, who would have thought we were in the throes of the 1980s at a time when you're talking about Israel, not only the issues regarding Palestine, but Israel being involved in Lebanon, for example, that you could even have the possibility of the Oslo Accords. Now, of course, without going into a long history lesson, that opportunity was lost in 2000 for an Israel-Palestine deal, and then 9/11 completely reconfigured international politics. But I'll give you a scenario which is contemporary. Remember that Benjamin Netanyahu lost his war cabinet over this conflict. Remember that the opposition to the way Netanyahu was conducting it was so great that Yoav Gallant, his defense minister, was forced out. Remember that Benny Gantz, who was head of the IDF at one point and was in the war cabinet, he left in opposition to Netanyahu. Now, it wasn't enough to take Netanyahu out of power, right? But the fact here is that if this military assault on Gaza City does not, quote, succeed, if it does not destroy Hamas, if it does not bring back the hostages, the political and military establishments, let alone the people in Israel, are going to have to think, wait a minute, what are we going to be doing in the longer term regarding Palestine, both the West Bank and Gaza? And they may not think that Netanyahu's way is the way forward. They might look at a Benny Gantz. They might look at Yair Lapid, who has a different type of approach in labor. But I do have to say, with respect, they could look even harder right with someone like, Israel Katz, the defense minister, or heaven forbid, someone like Yitzhak Ben-Havir, who's talking about raising Gaza to the ground.
Right. Thank you very much,
Thank you
Professor
very
Scott
much,
Lucas, for joining us and being a part of the discussion. Faisal, I want your take on this too, in terms of the way that Professor is pointing out, the way that we are going to measure the quote-unquote success of what is going on in Gaza. This is important, of course, to understand what sort of way forward or rhetoric that is going to be put forward in terms of the defeat of Hamas or in terms of the return of hostages. And how much do you think will it matter that that's what's actually happening on the ground, or is being reported, or is being said, because they don't really have to, of course, achieve any of these objectives unless they claim it to?
Yes, Sana, maybe they don't want to achieve, all of these achievements just because of one reason, that these achievements are only, or these goals are only to be shown to the world on the media, that this is what we want. And of course, one of them is related to, Israel focusing on bringing the people back, the hostages back, which to the world, of course, they're showing that this is what we are doing it for. I mean, everyone knows.
So they don't necessarily have to achieve that in order to claim victory.
No, not at all. Their design is entirely different. Their design is, of course, they want to have Gaza vacated. They want to make life miserable for people out there. People, they might, either they want them to die with the hunger, or if not, if they are surviving, then somehow one of the missiles that would be, of course, launched towards them, and that's how they can simply eliminate them all. And this is their end game, and the end game is that they want Gaza at any cost. And when we talk about whether they are, hopeful to get all of the hostages back, I think that is not their end game at all. And overall, looking at the larger picture, their design is that they want to have Gaza, they want to carry on doing whatever they are doing. Their designs are the same, and we shouldn't be forgetting that they were, of course, the maps of Greater Israel. They have been shown to the whole world, claiming that this is somehow 3,500 years ago, it was a promised land. Somehow somebody has promised this land to them, and they have to, of course, work in that for them. And to me, I think this is entirely related to that. And overall, there is a design which they are pursuing. There is a mechanism, there is a modus operandi which they are pursuing, and as long as they get the ultimate goals which they are always having in the back box of them, until then we will never see peace, of course, prevailing in there, because it's not about Netanyahu, it is not about anyone else. It's the deep state of Israel, and deep state of Israel did not start with the claims of Israel being a country. They started back in late 19th century, where of course we saw someone called Herzl, Theodor Herzl. He was the one who actually came up with this plan somehow, and the Zionism is the actual ball game of today's Israel.
Right, but Farouk, I want your take, because in terms of the way that we are actually looking at what is really happening on ground, whatever we see is so devoid of the reality in terms of course, what has been said or reported for the past 2 years or so, in terms of what is being claimed, and then of course also in ways that we understand there is no consequence. So all of what is happening right now is also something that can have that can still continue to happen post any sort of resolution that they put forward. If it works in their favor, so be it. If it doesn't, they'll at least make it sound so.
That's a very good question, and I tell you something very interesting. I don't want to undermine the sacrifices of everybody who has actually worked meticulously to build a global system of justice, right? Yeah. But I must tell you that international law has always been a carefully curated fiction, and it only helps the powerful. As pointed out by Professor Lucas, any country that has not been defeated in a war, their leaders don't get to be tried for human rights violations to such an extent, particularly for genocide. That is not all. When you look at the state of affairs, even before, I mean, there were invasions of Iraq and umpteen other places. Do you think that they were according to international law? They were not. And that actually brings us to Netanyahu's game. And you have to understand it, but before unless I forget, I want to actually clarify my own statement earlier. When talking to Professor Lucas, I said that the last elections in Gaza were held in 2009. The parliamentary elections were held in 2006. Presidential elections were held in 2009. And Abu Mazen once again became the president of the Palestinian Authority. But now coming back to Netanyahu's game, what exactly is it? He wants to stay in power, but his goal is not some greater Israel or something of that sort. Remember that every time these two countries, Israel and India, they commit any international violation of boundaries, what do they invoke? They invoke America as examples. For example, recently Israel actually spoke about 2011, and India actually also cited the same thing. Why is that happening? Because these guys want the old global war and terror days come back. And that global war and terror thing actually benefited these two countries, Israel and India, more than anybody else. If you ask me, these two leaders, one Netanyahu and the other one is Narendra Modi, they are orphans of global war and terror. So they want that to come back. How does that happen? Professor Scott Lucas said that there can be an occupation of these areas, but it will be unstable occupation. What does that mean? That means people will rise up and start attacking again. And if that continues and if that actually increases, that bubble increases, it might actually lead to something like 9/11 or something like that. So these people, Modi in India, Netanyahu in Israel, they want the same kind of mistake being made by some Muslim, and then they can revive the war on terror, and then they start, getting all the benefits, and they can actually speak from the moral high ground that, look, we are the good guys, and these Philistines actually keep on attacking us. So this is the whole game, and because of that, he wants to create a world which is so unstable that it benefits an unstable country like Israel and keeps on benefiting a person with, shaky morals like Netanyahu.
Right.
And Sana, I just wanted to add in a few chips, and they are related to when I, of course, compare India and Israel, it is obviously a wish of India that it becomes so important for US in the region as Israel is important in the Middle East. They want that kind of importance here. But when we take the example of both of the countries, it is more like for Americans, Israel is like a showroom. When you go to a showroom, everything is so well placed, and it's a showroom.
Yeah.
But when we talk about India, that's why I wanted to have that kind of importance in the IT sector. But
Right.
Americans, they have always treated India as a workshop, somewhere right in the back where all of the garbage is and where all of the the workshop stuff, everything is mismanaged out there. And India and Israel, they have a huge difference, but India always started pretending in the region as if they are,
Yeah.
of course, equally important for US. US has actually shown a mirror to India after post 2025, May 2025 war, and I think that game has ended for India. But when it comes to Israel, of course, it is still going on, and the Western countries, especially US, they will keep on, of course, helping them out because it is pivotal for them.
Right.
And I just
Yes.
allow me to actually present a counterpoint, because this program is after all called The Debate. This argument that Israel actually occupies some very important position in America's foreign policy, that is out of necessity, that is not because of any kind of advertisement. And I tell you why. I think that if you read that book by Professor Dr. Mearsheimer or other people who might have actually contributed to similar volumes, you
Yeah.
realize the kind of meticulous work that Israelis have done. In Urdu, they say "gite godo mein baith gaye."
Right.
That means they got under the skin, they got to the stomach, and they control everything, at least influentially, so that they can put pressure. India tried to do that, but it has been weeded out. Nobody in American foreign policy actually likes Israel or what it has been doing,
Yeah.
because America wants to be the good guy, and it has to align with, so if someday, Osama bin Laden had a state, the kind of nature of that state would have been Israel's foreign policy exactly of that kind.
Right.
So America wouldn't want that blot on its conscience, but unfortunately, it has to work with it. The Tucker Carlson has actually run many exposés on Israel's policy influence on America. You just watch that and you will realize that the time when people were fond of Israel is gone also.
Right. Thank you, Farokh Faisal, for joining us in debate. As always, that's all that we have time for. We'll now see you tomorrow.